So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And we're very, very excited to have this conversation. I began thinking this morning about trust, and specifically about the word truth and how, if you squint, they kind of blur together. But the reality is, trust is a very specific and complicated conversation, and really very, very excited to have with us four extraordinary thinkers and leaders in this space. Amy Mitchell is the Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center. Vasant Dhar is a professor at NYU Stern and the Center for Data Science. Janet Coates is the Managing Director for the Consortium on Trust in Media and Technology at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications. And Richard Edelman is the President and CEO of Edelman. All of you, welcome very, very much for coming. And I'm just going to start with a slightly provocative question to get things off on the right foot. By the way, we seem to have somebody's microphone on in the background. I'm not sure who that is. I'm hearing clicking. So maybe we can mute everybody other than our speakers. So as we look back, it's been 4 years of the Trump administration, and it's clear that one of the political strategies of the Republicans, and specifically Trump, was to amplify distrust. I mean, this is not accusatory, it was a strategy. And the claims of fake news and fake media and mainstream media echoed. So I guess my question to the panel, just to kind of open it up, is now that we're in a new administration, are we at the end of that? Does the problem of mistrust, specifically in media, now begin to recede? Or is that me being overly optimistic?
No.
I can say I think it's overly optimistic. Certainly, we've seen the gaps widen in questions around trust and attitudes about the media generally since the 2016 election, but there has been, questions about trust for decades. It's certainly been an issue that the media has been focusing on for a long time. And with a lot of that built around partisan divides, Republicans have been less trusting generally of the news media for a long time, particularly at the national level. But that just, widened dramatically after 2016 and, was both added inspiration and validation when you had the president that was sort of feeding that fire publicly. At the same time, along with that, came opportunity to, even more than in the past, to be able to separate oneself into your own information zone and to sort of cordon off, whether it's through social media or these other private channels, to really create one's own sense of reality and to sort of feed off of that. And so, there's not been any sign of that, lessening. And there are lots of other issues that are part of the issue and problem of trust that happen beyond the political mistrust, in terms of whether it's understanding where funding's coming from, understanding feeling like the people feel connected to the journalists in their local area. So it's a very complicated and nuanced issue that's been around for a long time.
Being right here and appreciating what's right.
All right, we got to figure out how to mute the audience.
Yeah, I don't know what.
And that is what the ego is so good at doing.
And there are two pieces, right? So one is 2 meters, 80 centimeters.
We're going to get the math lesson.
2 meters, 87 centimeters. Okay, so what can we do?
I'm back.
What can we do?
There is. So Richard, let's talk about the trust barometer. I thought this was 3 years old, 5 years old, but you're telling me this began 20 years ago.
Yeah, 21 years ago. It came because there was the battle in Seattle that some of you may remember between the NGOs during the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle, and it was a big protest against globalization. And there was a whole sense of unfairness and wages difference, and so we decided to see who these NGOs were and how believable they were, and in fact, they turned out to be the most trusted institution ahead of business, government, and media. And so in the more recent data, what's interesting is that business for the first time has emerged as the most trusted institution. You saw today that 500 CEOs signed that petition about voting rights and whatnot. That's a complete change in environment. But as for media, it's the now least trusted institution. And it's like an airplane running out of fuel. And it was going. And I love Janet's expression. It was going down slowly, but then the last 4 or 5 years have been precipitous. And particularly among Republicans, 18% trust in media at the moment. It's a deeply partisan country.
So Janet, talk about local. How does local play a role in all this?
Well, my background, I was a local newspaper editor for 15 years. And, we were talking before we got started here that 25 years ago, I was seeing conversations in my local community about losing trust in media, but it was framed as the liberal national press, right? That when I would go and speak to groups, I'd get a lot of the New York Times and, the liberals at the New York Times and the Washington Post, but their sense of my newspaper, their connection to local issues, there was a distinction there, right? They saw me as being someone who lived in their community, the reporters living in their community, and there was more trust around the local coverage. The complaints I got tended to be about the national stories we ran. And I think that a piece of what's happened in local, part of it is, of course, the decimation of local newspapers. I mean, that landscape is just a horror show. So just the decline in the amount and quality of local news. And then because we all live in this social media, bath all day, every day, even local news is now seen through that national perspective. So that polarized national perspective has, seeped down into the local coverage there is, and I think has driven people further apart, even in their local issues.
Does this, Richard, when we talk about trust, it's easy to talk about media, but the Trust Barometer looked at brands and looked at technology and looked at governments. Was there one thing that came out of this last year's review that was dramatically different?
The shocker is the decline of trust in technology. That tech went from the number 1 position among sectors to the number 9 position, along with, they're down there with retailers. I mean, tech has always set the standard sort of mid-70s level of trust. And I think it has to do with fear of job loss due to the pandemic, meaning automation. People can just, not have people anymore, workers. And also a real sense on privacy and security, hacks and whatnot. And that the tech industry's also made a hell of a lot of money in this pandemic. And there's too much concentration of power in a few companies.
Vasant, talk about trust in tech. We talked yesterday about whether or not, are we on the verge of an Orwellian world, or are we already there?
So let me just step back a second here. And, you started off with asking, what is trust? Is it the same as truth? And, I've been thinking about trust for some time myself, and it's a very slippery concept when it comes to human beings. You trust someone. It's not a binary thing. I might trust them with some things. I might not trust them with others. Richard pointed out that Republicans' trust of media is at 18%. Well, that's not surprising because they think the media is liberal, right? So, sort of, trust sort of lies in the eye of the beholder. Now, when it comes to tech, what I've tried to do is get on somewhat firmer ground, which is a risk-based perspective. How how predictable is something? Well, if something's more predictable, I'll trust it more. What are the consequences of mistakes? If the consequences are costly, then I'll trust it less. And so I've tended to think of trust in machines, in technology, in AI, as being sort of a function of these two things, of predictability and cost, and the cost of error. Richard said something interesting about like declining trust in tech, and I think that's worth probing a little more and asking why, right? Because tech today is very different from tech in the 70s, right? It was, tech then was low tech, for lack of a better term, whereas now we are sort of, being manipulated by machines. I had a couple of podcasts with Jonathan Haidt and Sinan Aral, and we talked about this, right? Are we being manipulated by machines? And the short answer is, yeah, we are. Because they've become smarter, they become, they're sort of more aware of what we want. So, when I go to Richard's data point and say, trust is sort of declining in technology, that's interesting. But the more interesting question is why, right? Is it because we've become more aware of the fact that we're being manipulated? Is it because we don't trust the objective functions of the operators of these machines? Like Zuckerberg and Dorsey certainly don't inspire a hell of a lot of trust, maybe Pichai a little bit more, but we wonder about the people who are operating these machines and setting the dials, and wonder whether these objective functions are to be trusted. We worry about transparency. Some of my research is descriptive and some of it is normative. The descriptive part is, well, here's the way it is, right? Here's the way different problems are, and the trade-off between sort of predictability and cost for error. But some of my work is also normative. It says we need more transparency. Like, let's use the financial industry as a model for the tech industry as well, where we require transparency and explainability. So that's kind of the way I look at trust. And finally, last but not least, is we trust airline pilots, right? We trust them with our lives, right? It's not good enough to be an almost perfect airline pilot. You have to be perfect, right? There's no room for error, let alone cost of error. And there we look at, do we trust that this individual will be able to deal with novel situations? And the answer is yeah. We trust a pilot with all those things. So it's just it's a rich term, and what I've tried to do is sort of make it more definable in the context of tech.
So Amy, historically, journalists were professionals and technology was platforms. But one of the things I wonder about from Pew's perspective is that's gotten a little blurry, hasn't it? And by the way, I'm just going to ask all of the audience members if you'd please mute your microphone. I think we're hearing some background noise. It would be helpful if you'd all mute. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I thought what you were saying, Vasant, was really interesting. And it brings in two other components, I think, that we need to think about when it comes to both, journalism and news media as well as technology, which is trust and then distrust, right? So there's something that, it's one thing to say, I don't trust something that much, but to actually distrust it is another level of rejection, of pushing it out, and that's one of the areas where we've seen that rise in, certain areas of news media questions that we've done, is that increase in distrust and rejection. And so for the news media, that means accepting what they're telling you as news and information. And when you have a certain part of the population or groups and segments that are rejecting that, it has a huge impact on the industry. Technology, functions differently in platforms. And I'll get to sort of the crossover a little bit in a minute, but it'd be interesting to see what that distrust element is of technology and how does it affect the way it's either utilized or not utilized. So one of the things that we saw, for example, is the impact of convenience when it comes to technology. So when we ask about, trusting news and information you get from different areas. So we ask local news organizations, which still rank highest, national news organizations, news and information you get from your friends and family goes down a little bit. You ask about social media, that trust level goes way down. It's in single percentages, and it's been there each year as we've asked it over the last 5 years. people are still using it, and the thing they like the most about it is convenience. And so there's a lot of things that that come into play that end up coming into play in how that trust or lack of trust impacts the industry itself, because the convenience factor around technology still drives a lot of people to social media, even if they bring a level of skepticism to it. And we're at a point where there's not, we've got such proliferation of ways to get news and information today, and outlets, particular sources of news, that it is also very easy for somebody to totally tune something out if they're choosing to distrust it and reject it. But I will also, just to finish with your initial question too, Steve, is that we definitely find when we ask people to say things like an open end, what's your main news source? You have a significant part of the population that's going to name Facebook, or is going to name, Twitter, or one of these that's a platform pathway, but not a specific source or news organization itself. So there definitely is murkiness and confusion even in people's understanding, of what is what and what role each one plays.
All right, devil's advocate question for the panel. Maybe the concept of trust is outdated. Maybe it's maybe just to be an optimist for a moment, people being more distrustful means they're being more quizzical. Maybe they're being more analytical. Maybe they're not accepting mainstream single source information, and they want to look at it from different points of view. Richard, what as a media communications person and a public relations professional, why is the decline of trust not a good thing?
You have about 25% of people who've signed off of information altogether. Literally, and this is very correlated to education, they learn from their friends, and that's enough. And I find that deeply disturbing. When Janet was editor of the Tampa paper and whatever, it was just a standard operating procedure that kids would learn from their parents the habit of reading the paper in the morning. And it might have started with the sports page as I started, and then migrate to business or news or whatever. But we're out of the habit. We haven't really replaced it with anything. And so I find it amazing, Steve, that the number one source of credible information is actually information from my employer. Now think about this, and Amy, in your work. So a newsletter from the J&J or PayPal or whoever it is, the employee newsletter, is the primary source of information about vaccination, for example, that's believed by the employees, because it's not politicized. It just says, here's where you can get your shots if you're 50 years old, and here's where you can't. And, so it's a vote against ourselves in a way, because I think without quality information, we can't make quality decisions. And that's the thing that disturbs me the most. And it's why I'm urging my clients, if they are going to be doing corporate newsletters, to change their methodology and stop doing it as classic PR, but be more about, quality information. Products don't always have just good things. They have side effects. And you better say both, otherwise you have no believability.
So, Tim Cook,
Steve, can I just add?
Yeah, of course.
Can I just add something? So I think that's a great question. Like, why is the decline of trust not a good thing? Actually, it could be a good thing if we're getting smarter, right? I mean, I always tell my students, don't trust everything you read in the newspaper, right? It's written by people, half the time they're guessing or they're expressing opinions. Like, be skeptical, right? So it might actually be a good thing that there is this decline in trust, because it's indicative of people actually waking up and saying, oh, I thought I was just sharing pictures and photographs, and I just trusted the platform, and geez, now I see, I ought to be more careful because I'm being manipulated. So in that sense, it can actually be a good thing. The decline in trust is not necessarily alarming.
I think that's a really important point, Vasant. And I think, we saw 63% of US adults that said that it's a good thing to bring a healthy sense of skepticism to your news, to the news that you're reading. Like, the public saying it's good to have some of that skepticism, just like you're talking about, so that you question, so that you go to 2 sources or 3 sources, or dig deeper and follow links. And I think that, the question ends up being when there's it's not a kind of skepticism, but a rejection. And I think that's, that may be a distinction there that's important.
So I get antsy when people say to me on social media, do your research.
Yeah.
Because I can Google anything. I could Google, in 3 seconds, I could find a page that would convince me that the world is flat, or that, the government is spraying some secret, chemical out of airplanes. So when people say do your research, what they mean is Google until you find the answer you actually want. And there's a reason, for example, that I don't read, medical journals, because I'm not a doctor. And so when people start going into professional verticals and reading them and then pulling out sentences randomly and using that as evidence, there's a lot of that going on. I got into an argument with someone the other day who was trying to convince me that all of the various gun control conversations that are going on were pointless, and that he had evidence to prove it. And I guess my question is, are we the victims of too much information?
But Steve, you're Janet, go first, please.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One is that in some of the research around media literacy, and some of the things that I've been involved with in the past in media literacy, is that there is a counter effect, right? So you're trying to teach people verify. You've got to go deeper. You've got to check your sources. And some of what we're seeing from that is people go down rabbit holes. You start checking your source, and that keeps leading you down and down and down into, you can get into the kind of this obsessive path that can lead you to some scary places. In the process of trying to verify, you actually wind up in going down some roads that, to your point, Steve, are conspiratorial, that you kind of reinforce what you want to believe. I think, to Richard's point, as much as anything, and I've spent a lot of time around, the conversation about media literacy and making people smarter consumers and more skeptical consumers. I think we have a demand problem as much as we do a literacy problem. I mean, the people who are, to Richard's point, I get my news from my friends. I find out what's going on from my family. If it's important, it will find me kind of thinking. Maybe we need to, well, not maybe, I would argue that we need to spend as much time on the front end of demand, and how do we help people, develop a healthier media diet that exposes them to information and to areas in a skeptical, discerning way, so that literacy, that understanding becomes more organic.
So let's just talk for a minute about solutions. There is this, it seems like bipartisan, which is not a word you get to use often in a sentence these days, agreement that something's going to change in the way the federal government provides safe harbor to social media platforms. Is there a positive outcome to the Section 230 debate, or is it only, are the outcomes only terrible?
Can you restate that question? I'm not sure I get the intent. Yeah.
Okay. So
are you saying is 230 good or bad? But I think you're saying something more.
No, I'm saying that the Republicans and the Democrats seem to agree that 230 is up for grabs. And so is there any version of the story where the government opens this Pandora's box and makes things better?
I mean, I don't see how they couldn't make. I don't see how things. Well, let me just restate. I don't think what they can do to make things any worse, right? I think the worst thing will be inaction, right? Because then we'll just get business as usual, and that's no good, right? I mean, Richard stated technology is on the decline for good reason. We're just going to see more of that, right? So unless lawmakers get their hands around this, and it seems like they're beginning to do that right now. I was actually encouraged by, Congressman Cicciolini's, group of, congressmen and senators. I mean, they seem to get their, we made tremendous progress from the first hearings in 2018, which were embarrassing, with questions like, how do you make money, being addressed to Zuckerberg, right? I think the discussion has gotten a lot more sophisticated now. So I think lawmakers are beginning to get their heads around this, and I think they'll do something, and I'm optimistic that the outcome will be positive, that they'll actually impose some constraints and require more transparency, which can only be good.
I guess, I would add that I think, and not specifically about that piece of legislation, but I also would say, for folks to be careful not to put everything on technology as a solution, right? There's so many other elements at play when it comes to trust. When you have half of U.S. adults saying that most local news they get is covering an area outside of where they live, and how much they're looking for some type of connection to their local journalist, to that news organization, but most of the time they don't feel it. 2% saying news organizations do not share enough information about where their funding's coming from, about how they pick their sources. So there's a lot else at play. Technology has certainly exacerbated and accelerated a lot of the separation and a lot of the ways that people can choose to reject or to go down rabbit holes, a very narrow silo of a vantage point. But there are a lot of other elements at play, and the financials of the news industry itself, is a huge one.
So I'm going to ask a question at the risk of causing trouble. Each of you is very smart. Each of you thinks about trust deeply. It's not cocktail party conversation. It's intellectual and complicated. Would each of you reveal a demon that you have and make an attempt to scare the hell out of us?
Steve, I fell for a hoax on April Fool's Day, which was that the vessel in Hudson Yards was going to have to be disassembled because so many people had jumped to their death. And I know the sculptor, I know the guy, and I wrote him in a panic, and I said, "Jesus, Thomas, this is so terrible." And he goes, "You're insane. What is wrong with you? You fell for the hoax." And by the way, it's nobody can go on it because of COVID, but anyway, I felt like such a schmuck. Here I am talking about check your sources and all this stuff, and I was so emotional about this because I know the guy. I just went right into the rabbit hole, as Janet described it. So, oh my God, I was caught like a fish.
You're not alone. I get information all day and often literally can't remember where it came from. Was that Instagram? Was that Facebook? Was it an email? Was it a text? If you try and reverse engineer it. So Amy, I have a feeling that you have a potentially risky future as one of the things you worry about.
Let me think. What would, so, there's certainly a lot of challenges. And I think one of the things that we saw over this past year, well, I guess I'd say there are two. One is just what's news? What's news today? What do people decide to put in that bucket of news? And it gets harder and harder and murkier. And we did a year-long study about how do you ask about news consumption today, which was fascinating to do. But just that question of what fits as news, right, is can be really, really hard to ask people to define or to understand. But I think one of the other things that if we look back over the year of the pandemic thus far, the degree to which that trust or distrust of information and who you're choosing to listen to and the politicalization of that information coming out around the COVID-19 virus had incredible impact, on the country. And so when we think about, the degree to which some of these hugely important events that are occurring can turn into information wars in a way is really scary, in a lot of ways. And I think that's when you think about how can it impact the world, our country and the world, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, my demon is I had all three of my kids around the dinner table last night for the first time in a long time. So I have a 24-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a 16-year-old. And we always end up in some kind of political or media conversation because children's journalists are not normal children. But they got into a conversation that I was mostly just listening to about trust. I told them I was going to be, and they got into this, what do you trust? And the answer was nothing. And my 16-year-old son said, we need to burn it all down. All corrupt. It's all about racism and misogyny, and everybody's pushing their own agenda, and nobody's thinking about me and my future, and it just all needs to burn, which was the first time I'd heard him be quite that direct. So, we want to think in some scary ways about trust. It is a much bigger issue than technology. It's a much bigger issue than media. It's a distrust in the system, however you want to define the system, that I'm hearing from my young adult children, and that's my demon. How do we get in front of around that?
So I want to ask Vasant this question. By the way, audience members, if you haven't muted your microphones, somebody's typing and we're hearing a keyboard. Vasant, I saw an AI the other day that has the ability to write restaurant reviews. It goes to a restaurant website, pulls things off their menu, puts together, and we've already got machines writing sports reporting and financial news, and that scared the hell out of me, because to me those human reviews that I read are the only thing that helps me know, particularly on Amazon, oh, a bunch of real people had a good experience with this product. So if there's an AI on the horizon that's going to write reviews and game that system, are machines likely to be much more prevalent in this world of trust or fake trust?
Yeah, absolutely, right. But I want to back up a little bit and point to what my fellow panelists said a few minutes ago, right? The problem is humans. Like, humans are a huge problem, right? We don't trust humans because we feel that they've got an agenda, right? Very often, especially news organizations and all of that, right? And we also, I think biologically, and maybe I'm getting philosophical here, and I'll, we tend to distrust, or we tend to trust people more when they're like us, right? Whether it's philosophically, racially, however you want to call it, we're just sort of wired that way, right? And that's the thing about humans. We just sort of, and we're on this sort of murky turf. On the other hand, you pointed out like those reviews that are really useful because somehow we trust humans to be objective, when it comes to reviews, right? So you're raising a really interesting question, which is, when do we trust humans, right? And the answer is not often, right? But sometimes we do. We'll trust them with reviews, but we'll make our own adjustments, right? And say, yeah, I trust these guys. This guy's ranting a little bit too much about the product, right? So we make those kinds of adjustments, right? But the world of humans is just fraught with difficulty when it comes to trust. Machines are just much easier to trust, for the most part, right? You sort of make your decision as to, how predictable is the problem, right? How often does the machine get it right? What happens if things are wrong, right? So, with machines, we're on firmer ground in some sense than we are with humans. But to come back to your question, yeah, I think the future is just going to be more prevalent with machines making decisions for us. And we're going to have have some sort of a framework to figure out when do we trust machines, just like we have with humans, right? We've been dealing with humans all our lives, and we sort of have a sense of like, who do we trust, who do we not trust? You know, whether that's rational or biased is another matter, but we get comfortable with that. We need to do the same thing with machines, and we're not there yet, right? But we're going to have to develop these frameworks of trust, and that's kind of what most of my research is about.
But Steve, the fake kind of Ayn Rand kind of libertarian view of it's all a charade. It's all to keep government away, give it the Heisman, and the markets will correct. People are able to pick out the good from the bad, and of course, search results will reflect more people getting the truth. I think that's demonstrably not working, and the idea of the system being ruined by disinformation is part of that. But it's also we make bad choices, and we share 10 times more often, according to your own statistics, fake news than real news, because it's more interesting, like my own vessel story.
But by the way, for what it's worth, I don't know for a fact that they're actually going to put grass on Lincoln Center's plaza. I saw it in a feed that came this morning. I looked at it and I shared it.
There you are, and you may be right, and you may be not.
I hope I'm right. Just to make sure we have one last question for everybody. Talk to me a little bit about your personal information diet. How has it changed? What do you read in the morning? Do you listen to podcasts? What's changed in the last couple of years about the way information makes it? Because you're all information professionals, so theoretically, your diet should be incredibly healthy.
I'll start. Okay. So I'm very traditional. I Times, Journal, FT, Bloomberg. Then I also now have a new diet of Axios and Politico and sort of email newsletters like DealBook or whatever. I would say my magazine consumption has diminished. I was a big reader of The Economist and Bloomberg Business Week and Fortune. And I get to them, but I stack them up and then I just go like this. And I don't know. That's it.
No podcasts?
Zero.
Fascinating.
Oh, wow.
So I'm a little bit like Richard, but I'm listening increasingly to podcasts. I guess one of the reasons I started my own is because I was inspired by a few, and I just find podcasts sort of more efficient in terms of how much I learn per unit time. So once I sort of if people recommend podcasts to me, I almost definitely listen to them. But it has to come from a trusted source. So I've started including more of those in my personal information diet.
Yeah, I'd second the podcast, and I think for me, it's there's an efficiency or a multitasking element to it, I guess. But I think there's also I've just had a more of a hunger the last couple of years for more in-depth, for just being able to sort of go deep into something and kind of lose myself into some particular issue, story, learning, whatever it is around, what's going on in the news today in the world. That I think that's part of what's driven my interest and kind of desire to have those longer stretches of intake. I think the other thing I guess I'd say is I've been very conscious of changing up my news and information routine on a regular basis. So trying to not fall into the same pattern of going to the same place first every day or ending my day with X, but to really be trying to mix it up, both partly, for the work that I'm focused on, but also just for my own sort of personal kind of staying awake, and tuned in to the different types of information streams there are and different ways that the same event might be reported or talked about in spaces. So I think trying to really consciously focus on variety and then just that hunger for in-depth, one or two in-depth things a day is really driven me.
Janet?
Well, New York Times, Washington Post. I read my local paper, the Sarasota Axios. Usually listen to either Morning Edition or All Things Considered. I don't always do both of them. I listen to the Daily. And I will. Oh, the Atlantic is like one of my must reads. But I will admit my dirty little secret, which is I spend way too much time on Twitter. Way too much time. Curated my little Twitter feeds, and I've got, my journalism people that I follow and the political people I follow and the media disinformation news literacy people I follow. But I need like a rubber band to snap on my wrist or something to spend less time there. It is very seductive, and I go there more than I should.
Well, we are out of time. You have all been incredibly generous, both with the time that you've shared with us today and with your insights and sharing some personal information as well. Thank you all. We will send out links to all of your work and look forward to seeing you at future Media Lab events.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Steve.
everyone.
Thanks, Steve.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.